Friends, I'm inordinately pleased this evening to welcome Father John Baldovin to campus for the first annual Liturgy lecture of the Notre Dame Center for Liturgy. Introducing Father Baldovin is a particular pleasure for me, since several months ago he served as a gracious and critical reader of my own doctoral dissertation. Father Baldovin is professor of historical and liturgical theology at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. His prominence within the field of liturgical studies is known throughout the Theological Academy. And he is truly a liturgical theologian, fully capable of speaking on the historical development of liturgical prayer within urban settings in particular, such as Jerusalem, where he initially made his kind of mark in the field. But in addition, he's a remarkable commentator upon the theological foundations of liturgical and sacramental prayer within Christianity. And in addition to all of this, he also provides remarkable pastoral formation of priests and lay people and the art of prayer itself. And this is many of the gifts that Father John provides at Boston College itself. But the question remains, why have we asked Father Baldovin to speak on Eucharistic adoration, particularly as the Church prepares for a new translation of the Missal this Advent? You see, at the heart of the Eucharist is an intimate encounter with the self-giving love of Jesus Christ, offered to the Father and made possible through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And in the midst of a variety of Missal preparations, one may wonder if certain features of this encounter may have been sublimated to arguments over philosophies of translation and ecclesial politics. That the Eucharist requires attention to more than words, but to the very way that Christ seeks to communicate, to share the logic of a love that gives itself unto the end, to the Church. To transform the Church, that the Church itself may become what is received in the Eucharist, what the Church already is. That is, if the Church is attentive to its own Eucharistic identity. And thus, there's a kind of wisdom implicit to the practice of adoration, particularly if performed by those schooled in the art of this prayer. A moment in which we express gratitude for what we are becoming through the carrying out of a Eucharistic life, made possible through the celebration of the Mass. And I believe few people can address this topic with a greater sense of the theological, pastoral, spiritual, and ecclesial implications of adoration. And so at this point, I'd like to welcome Father John Baldovin.
It was a very good dissertation. I didn't have much criticism at all. Thanks, Tim. That was really lovely. I'm very pleased to be with you all this evening, especially pleased that I see a number of my old friends here, colleagues, and former students, and also even some of my confreres, which is always a nice thing for a Jesuit. I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you this evening. I think Tim just gave a wonderful summary of my talk, so I feel like I could sit down. But on this whole subject of Eucharistic adoration today, I'm going to begin with some words of Pope Benedict XVI, and then I'll proceed from there. In his 2007 post-synodal apostolic exhortation, which is given the Latin title Sacramentum Caritatis, Pope Benedict XVI has this to say about Eucharistic adoration. It's toward the end of his second part of the exhortation, which is on the celebration of the Eucharist. At paragraph 66, he says this. These are two relatively long quotes, so bear with me. Pope says, a growing appreciation of this significant aspect of the Church's faith. He means the relationship between the celebration of the Eucharist and Eucharistic adoration. has been an important part of our experience in the years following the liturgical renewal desired by the Second Vatican Council. In the Eucharist, the Son of God comes to meet us and desires to become one with us. Eucharistic adoration is simply, and I want to emphasize this, simply the natural consequence of the Eucharistic celebration, which is itself the Church's supreme act of adoration. Receiving the Eucharist means adoring Him whom we receive. Only in this way do we become one with Him and are given, as it were, a foretaste of the beauty of the heavenly liturgy. The act of adoration outside Mass prolongs and intensifies all that takes place during the liturgical celebration itself. Indeed, only in adoration can a profound and genuine reception mature. And it is precisely this personal encounter with the Lord that then strengthens the social mission contained in the Eucharist, which seeks to break down not only the walls that separate the Lord and ourselves, but also and especially the walls that separate us from one another. Beautiful way of putting together the celebration, adoration, and of course the mission of the Christian life, which flows from both of those. He goes on in another paragraph, 2 paragraphs later, to say this: the personal relationship which the individual believer establishes with Jesus present in the Eucharist constantly points beyond itself to the whole communion of the Church and nourishes a fuller sense of membership in the body of Christ. For this reason, besides encouraging individual believers to make time for personal prayer before the sacrament of the altar, I feel obliged to urge parishes and other church groups to set aside times for collective adoration. Naturally, already existing forms of Eucharistic piety retain their full value. I am thinking, for example, of processions with the Blessed Sacrament, especially the traditional procession on the solemnity of Corpus Christi. The 40-hour, I'll come back to these actually with greater detail later. The 40 hours devotion, local, national, and international Eucharistic congresses, and other similar initiatives. If suitably updated and adapted to local circumstances, these forms of devotion are still worthy of being practiced today. So we can see at the highest level of the Church, the Pope himself, we obviously can understand that there's a clear desire for a renewal of a practice that seems to have diminished in many places in the past 40 years and has received renewed energy. I know on college campuses like this that it has obviously received a renewed energy. So, in light of what Pope Benedict has said, I want to do 3 things in this presentation. Jesuits always talk in threes. So. Good pedagogy, anyway. I want to do some history of the practice of Eucharistic adoration. Then I'm going to talk about the Church's operative document on instruction on Eucharistic adoration, which has not been changed since 1973. And then I'll finish with a kind of spirituality of Eucharistic adoration, and then we can have some conversation, I hope. First, a history of devotion to the Eucharist, especially Eucharistic adoration. I'm going to concentrate on the Western Church. The Church, as Pope John Paul II said, breathes with 2 lungs, but one of those lungs has not practiced much Eucharistic adoration outside of Mass. The Eastern Church, or the Eastern churches, have not had much of a practice of Eucharistic adoration outside of Mass. I think they're pretty satisfied with what they do in their own liturgy itself. So I'm going to concentrate on the West. I'm going to start with the 11th century, with the Palm Sunday procession with the Blessed Sacrament. It's the first time we know of something like this. A practice that was instituted, I think significantly, by Lanfranc of Bec, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc was as well known as Archbishop of Canterbury as an opponent of an 11th century heretic, Berengar of Tours. Berengar was a person who said that, to make a long story short, that the Eucharist is either a symbol, that is to say, a sacrament, or it's real. Dreadful mistake, but that's what he thought. It can't be both at the same time. That's what Lanfranc thought. It was a very difficult position to hold with regard to the Catholic understanding of Eucharistic realism. And so, Lanfranc started this procession, which of course grew in popularity. Moreover, in the 12th century, increased devotion to the Eucharist was very much a response to other kinds of Eucharistic heresy, especially the Cathars and the Albigensians, which posed a great threat to the Church in southern France, parts of northern Italy. They showed great disrespect for the sacrament. These, the Cathars and the Albigensians of the 12th century, were very much anti-body movements. I think the Cathars, for those who were really black belt Cathars, insisted on total sexual abstinence. That means, of course, that your movement's going to die out pretty soon. One of the things I'd want to emphasize most is that devotion to the Eucharist has a great deal to do, I'll come back to this, a great deal to do with love and respect for the physical body, the body of Christ, and I would say, therefore, of our own and of one another's. I'm not going to be giving you many footnotes in the course of this presentation, but I just want to at least give a nod to somebody from Notre Dame, whose work I found extraordinarily fruitful on this subject, Nathan Mitchell, in his book, 1982 book, Cult and Controversy, The Worship of the Eucharist Outside of Mass, and also the Oxford scholar Mary Rubin in her book, Corpus Christi, The Eucharist in Late Medieval Culture. There are a number of older works, especially in German by Peter Braue, and in French by Edouard Dubutet, and also in English by an English scholar named Archdale King. Let me throw in a parenthesis here. Of course, the 11th century was not the beginning of the practice of Eucharistic reservation. So I'm trying to make a distinction between the two topics of Eucharistic adoration and Eucharistic reservation. That practice of Eucharistic reservation, we know existed at least from the mid-2nd century, at least arguably, we can talk about it in the mid-2nd century, when Justin Martyr in Rome, around 155, describes communion being brought to the homebound, or to those who were absent from the Eucharistic celebration. In subsequent centuries, home communion and monastic communion, because many of the monasteries did not celebrate the Eucharist in their own monasteries, they didn't have any priests. St. Benedict thought it was a terrible idea to have a priest in a monastery. It would just screw up the equality of the brothers. That changed fairly quickly. These are major subjects today, major subjects of investigation, and my friend and former Notre Dame professor Robert Taft has written a great deal on the subjects of home communion and monastic communion. But I should mention that even today, the Church gives reservation for the sake of viaticum, that is to say, communion for those who are dying, as the primary reason for the practice of reservation. Now, back to the Middle Ages and the question of adoration. It's only in the 12th century that we find, for the first time, a practice noted called the elevation of the host during the Eucharistic prayer. Elevating the host at the consecration is included in the ritual of the Mass from the 13th century on. Very interesting, and I've written an article on this subject, that in the Roman Rite, the priest did not seem to have touched the elements until the end, the consecrated elements, until the very end of the Eucharistic prayer with the doxology, through him, with him, etc., until around 1068. At least that's the first notice I've been able to find of the practice of the priest touching the elements themselves. And then in the 13th century it becomes, so within a century and a half, basically it becomes a common practice to lift them up. So, elevating the host at the consecration was a ritual from the 13th century on. One of the great advances in the Eucharistic devotion comes with the introduction of the Feast of Corpus Christi, the body and blood of the Lord, as it's called today. That happened in the 13th century in the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands. It was a feast inspired by an Augustinian woman, visionary, from Belgium named Juliana of Liège. She had the good luck to have a future pope as her confessor. The feast spread rather quickly and was added to the Roman calendar a number of years later in 1317 by Pope John the 22nd. Thomas Aquinas has been identified with the poetic compositions for the feast. He's popularly identified. There's some debate over his authorship. Especially the compositions Lauda Sion Salvatorem, which is the sequence, the poetic sequence which precedes the gospel of the feast. It was common in the Middle Ages to have these wonderful poetic compositions precede the gospel on special feast days. The famous Dies Irae, which no longer exists in the Requiem Mass, was one such composition. And also the hymns, the Adoro Te Devote, Humbly I Adore Thee, and Pange Lingua Gloriosa, Sing My Tongue, the glorious body of the Lord. The popularity of this feast, Corpus Christi, also inspired public processions in honor of the Eucharist, such as the one mentioned by Pope Benedict in his exhortation. I remember, if you permit me a personal anecdote here, I remember as a youth, this is in the would have been 1950s, there was something we called Holy Name Sunday. It was on the last Sunday of October. I've never been able to figure out whether it was explicitly in opposition to Reformation Sunday, which would have been the Protestant practice, because the Protestant celebration of the Reformation on October 31st, or the last Sunday of October. It might well have been. But it occurred in our hometown, or in the diocese, I should say, in the two major cities. And we begin, I come from northern New Jersey, we begin in Passaic one year and end up in Clifton. And another year we then begin in Clifton and end up in Passaic at the local high school stadium. And everybody would march, all the men, the Holy Name Society was a society of males, all the men would march down the street and they had bands and all this stuff. But at the end of it, always, you'd go into the stadium, everybody would take their places in the stands, and then there would be an altar placed on a stage in the stadium, and a car would come in, black in the 1950s, always. The priest's cars were always black in the 1950s. A car would come in, and a priest would come out of the car. He was not driving, luckily, because he had a monstrance in his hand, with the humeral veil, and he would come up to the stage, and then we'd have benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. So it was quite a popular event, and obviously memorable in my decrepit memory. What becomes known as benediction of the Blessed Sacrament seems to have originated in a blessing during the Corpus Christi procession at one of the stops or stations during that procession in the early 14th century. I'm going to quote Nathan Mitchell's conclusion with regard to the historical origins of adoration. And he says this, and I think wisely. It must be emphasized, he says, that at their origins, Eucharistic devotions were not designed to eliminate or replace the normative expression of faith in the celebration of the liturgy. This is an emphasis that's quite clear in Pope Benedict. Eucharistic devotions are seen as ways to encourage, not inhibit, popular participation in both the Mass and the Liturgy of the Hours. That's the general history of the development of adoration and what we call benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, Eucharistic processions. I'm going to turn to more recent practice, particularly in the United States, to finish off this historical section. In 1791, Bishop John Carroll of Baltimore recommended the following with regard to Sunday worship for Catholics. And this is kind of a mouthful. It's a long quote, but it needs to be long because he was recommending quite a bit. 1791, Bishop John Carroll, first Catholic bishop consecrated for the U.S. In places where there are sufficient ministers, the Litany of Loretto of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the principal patron of this diocese, the Diocese of Baltimore, should be sung at the proper hour. After it is completed, let there be a solemn sprinkling with holy water, as it is prescribed in the Missal. Then Mass should be celebrated solemnly with singing, and on more solemn days, if possible, let a deacon and subdeacon assist. After the if you don't know what a subdeacon is, you can ask me later. After the gospel is over, the prescribed prayers for all ordinary needs and for the prosperity of the Republic should be read. The proper gospel for that day should also be read again in the vernacular. Of course, it would have been done in Latin at this period. The banns of marriage should be published, as should announcements about feast and fast days of observance and whatever else the people need to be forewarned about. Then there should be a sermon of such nature that it instructs and edifies the hearers and stirs them up to a more perfect Christian life. Just to contrast this to the 1 hour that we tend to spend in church. In the afternoon, Vespers should be sung, and after that, the antiphon of the Blessed Virgin Mary proper to the season. Benediction with the Blessed Sacrament. This is every Sunday that he's recommending this. Benediction with the Blessed Sacrament should then be given with solemn singing. Afterwards, there should be catechetical instruction. It is to be desired that during these services, some hymns or prayers be sung in the vernacular. Now, that's quite a mouthful, and it's quite a Sunday practice. It would take up the majority of one's Sunday. And my own mother, who was born in 1912, tells me that when she was a youth in their parish in northern New Jersey, they would regularly have Vespers on Sunday afternoons. Now, the pattern of Vespers combined with the benediction of the Blessed Sacrament was to become a familiar one, lasting in the U.S. churches up to the beginning of the 20th century, and many European churches really up to the middle of the 20th century. Now here's what a typical benediction service looked like, and the description is taken from an 1833 Catholic Church manual. It's very similar to the description in a ritual that was proposed in the early 17th century in 1614. Once again, a bit long, but I hope you'll bear with me. The altar is to be prepared with 12 lighted candles and a throne or small canopy placed between the candlesticks. The Blessed Sacrament, exposed in a monstrance, is placed on a corporal beneath the canopy. Corporal is the white cloth that is used for the celebration of the Eucharist. The officiating priest vests in surplice, white stole, and cope. A humeral veil, that is to say, the humors, the shoulders, veil that goes over the shoulders. A humeral veil is used at the point in the right when benediction is actually given. After the ministers, the celebrant, thurifer, and 2 acolytes enter the sanctuary, the sacrament is taken from the tabernacle, placed in the monstrance and incensed. Many of you who practice Eucharistic adoration today will be quite familiar with this kind of service. The choir, whilst the celebrant is incensing the Blessed Sacrament, the choir may sing O Salutaris Hostia, or O Saving Victim. I don't know whether you sing that in Latin or in English. Meanwhile, such hymns, antiphons, and litanies as are approved by the Church, or any psalm or motet extracted from the Psalms may be sung. Then the entire hymn, Pange Lingua, which is the hymn that we sing at the Holy Thursday procession, at the transfer of the sacrament at the end of the Eucharist, or at least the last two verses, which are Tantum Ergo, therefore before you bowing. So, and Genitori Genitoque, which is the doxology at the end of that hymn, should be sung. The hymn is followed by a versicle, Panem de Cielo Prestitis Dieis, and the response, Omne della Clementum in se habentum, and the prayer, the typical prayer for benediction was, O God, who gave us Deus qui nobis. Other prayers taken from the Roman Missal may be added. During the Tantum Ergo, the celebrant incenses the Blessed Sacrament a second time. The actual ceremony of blessing the people with the sacrament then follows. The priest in humeral veil turns toward the people with the monstrance in his hands and traces the sign of the cross over them. Of course, you have an altar that was obviously facing the wall, the eastward direction. No hymns are sung at this point, nor does the priest say anything. It's done in silence. The priest then places the monstrance back on the altar, removes the humeral veil, and puts the Blessed Sacrament back into the tabernacle. He and the ministers then genuflect and return to the sacristy. Now, the most common addition to this service, additions, I should say, were the vernacular paraphrase of the great Roman or Latin hymn Te Deum, a hymn sung in the Liturgy of the Hours on special occasions, solemn occasions. That hymn we know in its translation as Holy God, we praise thy name. That's basically a version of the Te Deum. It was written in 1853, first, I think in German. And then the divine praises, blessed be God, blessed be his holy name, etc., which first appeared in Italian in 1797. Holy God was normally sung as we praise thy name was normally sung as a recessional hymn at benediction. I need to mention one other practice recommended by Pope Benedict in the exhortation that I read at the beginning. That is the 40 hours devotion. Where did that come from? 40 hours devotion. This practice most likely originated with the burial of the consecrated host in the Easter sepulchre at the end of the Good Friday liturgy. So at the end of the Good Friday liturgy, the host would be buried in Easter sepulchre to be resurrected, of course, on Easter Sunday, about 40 hours afterwards. During that time, people practiced adoration. As a distinct service, Nathan Mitchell, outside of the Easter season, Nathan Mitchell traces it to 16th century Milan. Its popularity was enhanced by three extremely important 16th century saints. Anthony Maria Zaccaria, the founder of an order, small order now, known as the Barnabites, Philip Neri, the founder of the Oratory, and Charles Borromeo, the reforming Archbishop of Milan, whose feast we just celebrated a couple of days ago, 3 days ago. Let me turn now to the second part of the presentation, and that is the 1973 instruction. The Church's official and operative liturgical document with regard to Eucharistic adoration is currently the post-Vatican II, let's say 1973, Rite for Holy Communion and worship of the Eucharist outside Mass. From the beginning, the document makes it clear that adoration of the Lord in the Eucharist is intimately tied, as we've already seen in Pope Benedict, intimately tied to the celebration of the Eucharist. And that also that the primary reservation, which I've also mentioned, reason for the reservation, which I've also mentioned, is for viaticum, for communion of those who are dying. So why this insistence on the connection between celebration and adoration? To appreciate this directive, one has to recall the common practice in this period, from before 1960, the common practice of disassociating communion from the liturgical celebration. To explain this, and one great place you can find it is in a memoir of the liturgical movement by Dom Bernard Bot, a Belgian Benedictine, called From Silence to Participation. Towards the beginning, he describes what going to Mass was like in the first decade of the 20th century for him and for his family, especially when he was at school. In those days, there was no logical connection between the celebration of the Eucharist and the reception of Holy Communion. It may sound very, very strange to us. But Holy Communion could be given before Mass started, Holy Communion could be given after Mass ended, or, I must say when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I remember quite clearly, everyone had to go to the 8 a.m. Mass every day, and as soon as the consecration was over, another priest came out, went to another tabernacle, on the side altar, took out the reserved sacrament and began distributing communion. That was so that we kids could get back to class by 8:30, right? The classes were supposed to begin. So it was dissociated from the priest's communion at all. It had nothing to do with anything that was consecrated at that Eucharist. And in the words of Karl Rahner in one of his essays on Eucharistic presence, he said, in those days one had the impression that we consecrated in the Eucharist only so that we could adore it in the afternoon. Not so much for communion. I'm reading a fascinating book that was a Notre Dame dissertation by Joseph Doherty called From Altar Throne to Table, about the movement towards frequent reception of the Eucharist. This is a no-brainer for us to receive the Eucharist at every time that we go to Mass. But up until the beginning of the 20th century, and especially the promotion of the practice by Pope Pius X, frequent communion was not well known. And still in many parts of the world it's not well known. Hence the rule still in canon law that you have to go to communion at least once a year if you want to remain a Catholic. And that if you've committed a serious sin, you have to go to confession before you do that. Let me recall for you that the most popular benediction hymn, this connection between Eucharistic celebration and adoration, Tantum Ergo Sacramentum, consists of the last two verses of St. Thomas's great Eucharistic hymn, Pange Lingua Gloriosi. It's one of the very few metrical hymns. This is another topic, I'm sure, and I'm sure it could be addressed much better by my friends Margot and Peter. One of the few metrical hymns, that is to say rhymed hymns, that the Church has incorporated into the Eucharistic liturgy. There are very few of those kinds of hymns that come officially into the Eucharistic liturgy. Now that hymn beautifully connects the incarnate Lord Jesus, born of the Blessed Virgin Mary, his self-gift at the Last Supper, and the elements which we adore. You have to always keep those connections in mind. These sacred elements are the result, what we adore when we do Eucharistic adoration. These sacred elements are the result of the story of God's love for us in Christ, and lead us back, or should lead us back again and again, to the celebration of that love in the Eucharistic liturgy itself. The 1973 document goes on to place the Eucharistic presence of the Lord within the fourfold framework that Pope Paul VI introduced in his encyclical Mysterium Fidei, the Mystery of Faith, in 1965. Namely, that we can find the real presence of Christ in four different ways. First, in the assembly of the faithful themselves, in the Word as it is read and proclaimed, in the person of the minister, and above all and uniquely and substantially and permanently in the consecrated elements. But in all four of those ways. I want to pause here for a brief consideration of the ecumenical question involved in the reservation of the Eucharist, because for a number of traditions, after the 16th century Reformation, Eucharistic reservation makes no sense. A number of Protestant churches do not practice reservation of the Blessed Sacrament on the grounds that the presence of the Lord is attached to the elements only for the duration of the liturgical service itself and for the purposes of Holy Communion. In other words, what's left over in some places, what's left over at the end of the service is put back into the sacristy and put back into the refrigerator, etc., as if it weren't the consecrated body of the Lord. This is not the Catholic position, which has always taken seriously God's irrevocable commitment to his creation. And I emphasize that word, irrevocable. The greatest example, of course, being the incarnation of the second person of the Blessed Trinity as a human being, but also in the unrepeatable nature of three of the sacraments, baptism, confirmation, and holy orders, which are irrevocable. And the same irrevocable commitment of the Lord in the consecrated elements of the species. In other words, the idea is that what God has given, God does not take away. At least in the species, as long as they are discernibly food. Catholic tradition has always said that there is no presence of the Lord in what is decomposed, is no longer food, because the essence of the Eucharist is food and drink. Part of the beauty of the Catholic affirmation of sacramentality, which I'll return to in the third part of this presentation, is its firm insistence on what I like to call the tangibility of the holy. The tangibility of the holy. Of the fact that God really does commit himself to our created world in an embodied way. What our religion is about is not escape from the human condition and from the body. It's about engagement of that condition. The glory of Catholicism, I'd add, is its profound appreciation of the body. We take the body extremely seriously. The 1973 instruction goes on to recommend that churches be open at least for several hours a day to provide the opportunity for praying before the reserved sacrament. This would not be the exposed sacrament, in what we normally would think of as adoration, but praying before the reserved sacrament. It's rather difficult in a lot of churches today because of the thievery. Thus, there's always to be a prominent place, says the document, for reservation in the church, and that place should be conducive to private adoration and to prayer. The instruction goes on to say the following about the purpose of Eucharistic adoration. They say this in paragraph number 80. When the faithful adore Christ present in the sacrament, they should remember that his presence derives from the sacrifice, from the action of the Mass, the Eucharistic sacrament, and has as its purpose both sacramental and spiritual communion. And again, with regard to the practice of benediction, the instruction says, a couple of paragraphs later, at number 89, shorter expositions of the Eucharist are to be arranged in such a way that the blessing with the Eucharist is preceded by a reasonable time for readings of the Word of God, songs, prayers, and a period for silent prayer. Exposition merely for the purpose of giving benediction is prohibited. What they're trying to get away from is, negatively, it seems to me, is the idea that this is some kind of a magical occasion, and positively, that it's a true occasion for prayer. Prayer and for, in the context of the Word of God, singing, and silent prayer and adoration. The order for the service itself in 1973 is left very much up to the local church, and a number of prayers and hymns are recommended. You might think of a word service within an hour period of exposition. I'll give you just the outline of an Advent service that I once put together back in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at Weston Jesuit Community a couple of years ago. We began with the usual versicle and response, and glory to the Father, which begins the Liturgy of the Hours, O God, come to my assistance. We followed it by an Advent hymn. It was an Advent service, Creator of the Starry Skies. And then we brought out the Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance and exposed it. We had long periods of silence within all of this. I mention each period of silence, but there was kind of a cycle each time. Then we had a prayer, a reading. The first reading was taken from Isaiah chapter 29. Out of their gloom and darkness, the eyes of the blind shall see. Nice Advent theme, gloom and darkness in our northern hemisphere. Then a reflection. Instead of preaching, we had a reflection, a written reflection from the great Jesuit thinker, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Then we had another hymn. So the second cycle began with another hymn, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus, a prayer, and a reading from Baruch, the prophet Baruch, chapter 5, and a reflection this time from a Jewish author, Abraham Heschel. And then there was a kind of musical interlude, which we did. I have mixed feelings about this, but it was my idea, so it must have been a good idea. Now, I know there's some controversy over using recorded music at liturgy, because of the idea that really what we do at liturgy should always be authentic. We could not mount Franz Bibel's Ave Maria with the resources that we had. I like it. It's one of my favorites. It's a gorgeous piece, modern 20th century piece of music. So we played it, a recording from the choir of Trinity Church, Boston, Copley Square. After the interlude, we began again with another sequence. Lots of, as I say, lots of silent space in between. On Jordan's bank, the Baptist cry, the prayer, reading of Mark chapter 1, the first 8 verses, the call to repentance. The Lord, John the Baptist appeared in the desert. Then a homiletic reflection, not a reading, but a homiletic reflection. Then the hymn, Tantum Ergo, of course, for benediction, with the prayer and the blessing, the reposition of the Blessed Sacrament, and the divine praises. Blessed be God, blessed be His holy name, etc. Now, let me repeat. So that was one version of a typical, or at least a possible kind of service that would take about an hour and would have lots of content to it, but also lots of silence. And I think, of course, obviously, silent prayer is a big advantage in the practice of benediction. I'll come back to that in the third part. But I want to repeat that the most popular hymns for benediction, O Salutaris Hostia, O Saving Victim, Opening Wide, and Tantum Ergo Sacramentum, are both constituted by the final 2 verses of longer hymns by St. Thomas. The first is Verbum Supernum Prodiens, and the second, Pange Lingua Gloriosi. One was originally written for lauds or morning prayer for the Feast of Corpus Christi, the other for evening prayer or vespers. Both longer hymns narrate the Lord's gift of Himself to us at the Last Supper. It can only really be understood within the context of Eucharistic celebration. Okay, let me turn now to a spirituality for Eucharistic adoration, the third part and final part of my presentation. At the core of Eucharistic adoration is the encounter with a person with Jesus Christ. Why would I not want to spend time with someone whom I loved? And as often can be the case with persons that we love, why should that time necessarily be occupied with lots of talk and thoughts? Why would I not want to spend time with someone who loves me so much that He emptied Himself for my sake? A gift that continues every time the Eucharist is celebrated and endures in His sacramental presence. For me, this is the simple yet profound rationale for Eucharistic adoration. Simply being with the Beloved. Something that I think we can easily understand. This is an encounter which can take place in personal prayer before the Lord in the tabernacle, or during the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament in church. It can take place alone. It can take place in the midst of a community. I'm reminded of the contemporary musical setting of Psalm 16 by Paul Inwood, lovely song. Lord, you are the center of my life. I will always praise you. I will always serve you. I will always keep you in my sight. Now, today, I doubt that Catholics would consider this form of prayerful encounter, adoration, as a substitute for Holy Communion, as might have occurred in the past when communion was relatively rare. And that's clearly, it seems to me, part of the agenda of the 1973 document, Instruction on Worship of the Eucharist Outside of Mass. Instead, as Pope Benedict said so beautifully, adoration serves as a kind of overflow from the love of the Lord that I experience in Holy Communion. Communion's the key word here. Communion is the key word here. Let's not forget that the point of the sacrament, the point of the Eucharist, medieval scholastics would have used the technical term, the res, or the grace of the Eucharist, is union in and with Christ. In and with Christ. My personal union with Christ, and the union with Christ's whole body, the church. That's what the Eucharist is for. Participation in Eucharist, I'd submit, is the fruit of his loving, free, and self-emptying sacrifice for the life of the world. In that vein, I'll repeat what I said at the beginning, repeat the words of Pope Benedict. And it is precisely, he says, this personal encounter with the Lord that strengthens the social mission contained in the Eucharist. This is from a different part of the exhortation. And it is precisely this personal encounter with the Lord that strengthens the social mission contained in the Eucharist, which seeks to break down not only the walls that separate the Lord and ourselves, but also and especially the walls that separate us from one another. You want to read a fine expansion of that idea of the social mission of the Eucharist. I think I could recommend nothing better than one of the last pieces written by Pope John Paul II for the introduction of the year to the Eucharist, called Mane Nobiscum Domine, Lord, remain with us. It's got a beautiful section on that whole missionary dimension of the Eucharist. I would say necessarily missionary dimension of the Eucharist. Now, the normal means of Eucharistic communion is by eating and drinking the body and blood of the Lord. But human encounters can also take place through vision, through seeing. What Nathan Mitchell called ocular communion, visual communion. Sometimes when I am with someone I love, simply gazing is quite enough. I think that this is part of the appeal of praying before the exposed sacrament, simply being in the presence of the beloved. This element of pure praise and adoration is arguably a major factor in the popularity of adoration among many younger Catholics who live in such a terribly noise-filled and hyperactive world. In other words, put away the iPad, put away the iPod, put away the cellular phones, put away the text messaging, put away the tweeting, etc., etc., etc. Go on. You're just there in silence before the Lord, before the God who made you. It's a marvelous gift from the Lord. I think that the late Anglican theologian John Macquarrie captured it very nicely in an essay on the Eucharistic presence. That's what he said. An Anglican, very, call him an Anglo-Catholic, very sympathetic to Catholicism. And he would have practiced Eucharistic benediction and adoration. Macquarrie says this: the initiative is Christ's, and he is the principal minister of the Eucharist. He enables us to have faith, and indeed to be persons capable of knowing his presence. Our personhood is not something we already possess, but something that comes into being in relation to other persons. And in the Eucharist, above all, our personhood is enhanced, even created through the presence of the person of Christ. He is there before we are. He is there before we are. Our presence to one another in the Eucharist, so-called horizontal dimension, is made possible only through Christ's already being present and communing with us. Elsewhere, the same theologian, John Macquarie, employs the concept of focus to understand the nature of our sacramental engagement. It's a kind of focus. And I think this is an important thing to note. It's not as though Christ as God is not present always and everywhere in the world, but that in the Eucharist, above all, he enables us to see the focus, or to focus on his gift of self, his love to us. As with every Christian practice, I should note that the end result of Eucharistic adoration is union with God, or what the Eastern Christians like to call theosis, or divinization. We taste of this reality when we see our individual and communal lives becoming more filled with faith and hope and love. That is, when our sacramental and liturgical and spiritual lives are, in a sense, to use the words of the modern French Catholic theologian Louis-Marie Chauvet, verified. When these practices are verified by how we actually live the love that we receive from the Lord. That living out of the love of the Lord remains and will always be the final recommendation of Christian faith. As the love of Jesus Christ becomes incarnate, embodied in the lives of those who have been baptized in the name of the Trinity and anointed as members of the royal priesthood, as all of us who are baptized are. So finally, let me share with you some beautiful words to cap all of this off. I think they're beautiful words. From St. Thomas's Adoro Te Devote, one of his hymns. They were rendered into English by the 17th century English poet and priest Richard Crashaw. And with these words I'll end. O dear memorial of that death, which lives still and allows us breath, rich, royal food, bountiful bread, whose use denies us to the dead, whose vital guest alone can give, the same leave both to eat and live. Live ever bread of loves and be my life, my soul, my surer self to me. Thank you for your attention.
We have some time questions.
Are you giving a prize to the first person who answers?
Indeed. You get to leave the room.
Students have to go first.
Right.
Faculty hold back is what I always say. FHB. Faculty hold back. Please, Peter.
Are you seeing increased interest in benediction?
Absolutely, yes. There's much more interest. I think a lot of it has to do with the silence dimension of adoration. The fact that it's kind of like an oasis in a very crazy and busy world. I think it's also, I think there is a genuine desire on the part of a lot of people to recapture a kind of reverence which adoration really lends itself to, that people often do not find in our celebrations of the Eucharist. I would say to the shame of people like me who preside at the Eucharist regularly. But they find, you know, they find the casual celebration of the Eucharist lacks nourishment, adequate nourishment. So, I mean, the people, a number of the people here, I'll bet you, could tell us more about that than I could from practice. You're most welcome to share that with us.
Do you do benediction?
I have done it. I have not done it. We try. it died in my community. So, so here I am talking about something that we didn't succeed in doing. But we were doing it for a while. We're going to revive it this Advent. We're thinking that maybe seasonally it'll be better. We were doing it, but we were finding that nobody was coming, and so we weren't sure whether it was the time or. But it was I live in a formation community of Jesuits, about 70 Jesuits, and we were finding that maybe 4 or 5 would come on a Sunday evening, but that we'd get as many undergrads from BC or more that would come, which was interesting. But it kind of, but I would do it, yeah, sure, I would do it on a regular basis. I think it needs a lot of imagination too. I think that the standard form that I described from the 19th century description that I gave you, that's only one template of doing it. There is not, in 1973 they were quite clear that there is not an absolute form for doing benediction. Now, a lot of people think that what you find in the back of the missalette is the only way to do benediction. I don't think that's true. There are many ways to do it, including the one that I shared with you, that kind of Advent service that I described. Go ahead, Marco.
Well, one of the things that you could do, it seems to me, I mean, it would be hard to do it in Notre Dame because of the dorm masses, which are at 10 o'clock on Sunday nights. And that sort of siphons off a lot of things that could actually go on Sunday night. And on many college campuses, what happens on Sunday night is a compline service to sort of begin the week, I guess, and provide a really quiet and reflective time for prayer. And I think, I mean, I had always hoped, when I came here that something like that could be started, and then I ran into the dorm mass phenomenon. But I think that you could bring together compline and some sort of gesture that would also incorporate the old benediction service and bring those together on Sunday evening at the end of the week. That, I mean, maybe even in the hustle and bustle of life, if it weren't too late, you could get families involved in something like that. To kind of close out the weekend and start the day afresh.
Right.
I've often thought that there might be something that if we were all creative, we could really do something interesting there.
There are places, I'm sure you're familiar with, Seattle, the Episcopal Cathedral in Seattle, which has an enormously, I've never been to it, but enormously popular compline service. And compline does lend itself because there is a kind of quietude and simplicity, quiet beauty to the service of compline, night prayer. Well, obviously what I was trying to do in that service that I described to you was create kind of nocturnes from matins, kind of modern version of nocturnes as a kind of service, kind of threefold repetition. That worked, but they don't always work. Max?
Well, I was just going to say, I do have a question, but behind Margot is a young woman who was putting her hand up that I don't know if you saw.
Oh, please.
I'm wondering, you talked about how you shouldn't replace the Mass with adoration, but that adoration should be a natural outflowing of love and respect for the Eucharist. But what about those people who go to Mass and they don't understand it? Could going to adoration and taking time to set aside and focus on what it means, what the Eucharist means, and having that focused center time with the Eucharist right in front of you, could that be a way to increase devotion and reverence during Mass? So if the only time one could go to adoration is the time that there's the only Mass, would that?
I'm sorry, the last part?
If the only time one can go to adoration is the only time there is Mass, would that be an acceptable way to go to adoration to increase one's devotion during Mass?
Well, the Pope himself said in those opening quotes that I gave you, and I think quite correctly, that our primary form of adoration as Catholics is the celebration of the Eucharist. Right? Our primary form. What we're talking about tonight in terms of adoration, the reserved sacrament, is in a sense an extension of that. He calls it the natural overflow and extension of that. I think part of the problem, and I don't want to overstate this, but part of our problem has been that we have not shown that kind of reverence adequately. And I'm painting with a big brush here, so bear with me. But we haven't shown that kind of reverence adequately in the last 40, 50 years. Nor have we made the connections, another subject of another lecture at another time, but nor have we made adequate connections between what we celebrate in church and the rest of our lives. We've done a very poor job of that. Can adoration of the Eucharist outside of Mass help us to appreciate what goes on in Mass more? Sure. Especially with adequate kind of catechesis. And the idea of services of benediction, quite clearly, in the Church's mind, is to be connected with some kind of service of the Word, prayers and hymns. Thank you. Max?
Any thoughts on perpetual adoration? And I don't mean those religious communities that are known for that charism and so on, but I think increasingly we're seeing this develop at parish levels, other kinds of levels. And how do you see that fitting into the spirituality and the theology that you've been articulating?
Yeah, I find it a little problematic myself.
I thought you might, but I wanted to hear what you had to say.
Yeah, because I think it can take the focus away from the, I mean, in itself, it's not a bad thing, but I'm worried about the balance and the focus. We have a Eucharistic shrine in Boston, and they do a beautiful job. It's run by the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, St. Clement's in the Back Bay. And they do perpetual adoration, and they do pretty good liturgy too, I think. I think you'd have to work hard to give people the impression that this is not the only way of being a Catholic, and that, well, I mean, there's nobody who does perpetual, nobody could be there 24 hours a day, right? But the idea of somehow honoring the Lord on a continual basis, I mean, there's the, you're familiar, of course, I know, with the Akoimetai, the sleepless monks of Byzantium in the 6th, 7th century. Well, it's not that they went without sleep, right? But that there was always some people who were not sleeping, right? And who were praying, with that idea of keeping what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:17 alive, pray always. And that's, I think perpetual adoration is a kind of an overflow of that idea, that 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray always, which is not bad. But of course, none of us can do that 24 hours a day. And all of us also have to actively live the Christian life. So if you get the balance right, I quoted Louis-Marie Chauvet in my talk just briefly, but I think he's one of the, for my money, one of the best sacramental theologians going. And he talks about the Christian life as a balance that needs 3 legs to the stool to be balanced adequately. Scripture, doctrine, theology, sacrament, and ethics. And that when one of those legs gets out of whack, you don't have a balanced Christian life. And I think that's right. I think that's very good. A balanced diet. You know, we're all for a balanced diet. So the balanced diet of a Christian life pays attention to Scripture, to the sacrament, the liturgical life of the Church, and to how we live it out in ethics. It's much more complex than its words, but I'll leave that to your reading.
We have time for one more question, so that's all. I'll let.
Young man, I think, when you give the younger person the, okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, I just had a quick question about another little derivative practice, I guess. You talked about how one thing that you think attracts a lot of young people is sort of the silence and the simplicity and the raw purity. I'm curious what you think about maybe a little bit of a separate practice that I've also seen pretty popular, maybe more where I'm from on the West Coast. And that's adoration sort of paired with or coupled with modern praise and worship music.
Yeah, that came up earlier today. Somebody asked me that question at lunch. I have to confess, well, I think that's fine. I think anytime people want to pray, that's great. I would not want to discourage it. I don't know much about praise and worship music. I feel kind of out of it and like an old fogey. I'm very traditional in my musical tastes, so please bear with me. But I think in terms of adoration, it's fine. My problem with praise and worship music is when people want to use it at the Eucharistic liturgy, and it really doesn't fit. It's got to be, music with the liturgy really has to go with the flow of the liturgy and the genre and the purpose of those liturgical, musical elements of the liturgy. I have not experienced it, so if I had, I'd be able to have a better sense of it, even if I liked it or didn't like it. I was at a mass on the West Coast in LA. I presided at 2 masses a couple of weeks ago, 2 weekends ago. And the music wasn't my style, I have to say. It was less traditional than my own preferred style. But I'd have to say it was very liturgical and it was extremely well done. So, and that's the principle I should be applying as opposed to my preferences, as biased as they are. Good tip.
We just want to thank Father John for being here as a group, and so just kind of